All right, and we're on.
Okay.
So this is another episode of Things that First Year Writers Need to Hear, which is still the title until I can come up with a more exciting name. But for now, I think this at least conveys what it's about. I'm here today with Mariah Walzer, who's a former classmate, colleague, not sure what exactly the proper term is for someone with whom you once went to school, but we were at Hamilton together in the same year. And we both did the creative writing major, and you also double majored into archaeology, which is one of the reasons I'm going to talk about that. But the reason I have you on here is, like we were discussing beforehand, you're a really good writer. Yeah, smile and flattery and all that, fine. But just for the sake of the audience here, it's worth noting that Mariah is an exceptionally talented poet. I know you have had some things published, not only through the prize that you won at Hamilton, which book I still have sitting on my bookshelf in my apartment, by the way. Right, I think it's right next to the big copy of Milton. It's like on the whole like I hold like the poetry shelf.
Yes.
Like there's a Shakespeare shelf, there's a nonfiction, there's a poetry shelf, and yours is not in there. But suffice to say, you have all, at least as long as I've known, you've been exceptional, like quite frankly, head and shoulders above the rest of us in that class when it came to poetry. Yeah, you won't say it, but I will. And what's more, you also, like I was saying before, double majored into archaeology. And that's actually kind of what you're making your career out of now. So this is all to say that you have one foot in sort of a creative writing side of things and one foot in an archaeological or analytical writing side of things. And you seem to have planted your feet very firmly in each camp. And I'm kind of interested, first of all, in catching up, but second of all, in seeing if we can figure out what made you so good at both of those. Was it the same things? Was it different things? I realize, I think I'm asking you now what I probably should have asked you when we were sitting around the common room, at Hamilton. I want to know more about the process of your writing, I think. So I have a few different questions that I think might help us get at that, and we'll see which of those work out and which don't. But I do want to ask you this at the start, because it's kind of within the broader rubric of this whole podcast. This is kind of the thing we're always getting at. So if, hypothetically speaking, you had an hour to talk to an audience of first-year students about writing and what you thought they needed to know, what do you think first-year writers in college need to know that maybe they don't hear that much? And we'll maybe see if we can dovetail out of that into something else.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing for me, especially making that transition from high school to college, is please throw out the 5-paragraph essay. I don't know if you want to hear that as an English teacher, but I hate the 5-paragraph.
Are you kidding me? I love that. Go on.
Yeah, it's terrible. College essays, for one, your essays aren't going to be 3 to 5 pages anymore. They're typically more like 8 to 10, 8 to 12. They're a lot longer, so you can't just have 3 topics that you're going to cover. Like, you still need to have an introduction and a conclusion and your supporting arguments in the center. That makes sense. But it's much the way that I approach essays, and this I actually picked up from my AP Euro class in high school, in how to study for the AP essays. But when I start an academic essay, I just bullet point really quick the main points that I want to make. And whether that's 3, 4, 5, 6, however many, just what are the main points that I think I'm going to make in this essay? And that's where you start from. And you start with however many bullet points you have. And your number of paragraphs needs to be based on how many ideas are you trying to bring in. And if you need a paragraph in between 2 ideas so you can connect them, go for it. You don't have to figure out how to make them all nice and neat, like the 5-paragraph essay tries to make it. It can be a lot more free flowing and a lot more think a lot more about how your argument's going to move throughout your essay. Is it in a logical progression, not just this cookie cutter, like here's a paragraph, here's a paragraph, here's a paragraph, and maybe they connect, but maybe they don't.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. You were worried about me not liking the idea of throwing out the 5-paragraph essay. You kidding me? I'm not just on that train. I'm driving that train. I am. You could almost boil down the entire semester for me and my students is trying to beat that out of them. And it kind of starts to take it back for, I guess, to step back out. I think I've mentioned this on episodes before, but one of the things I tell my students on the first day is I don't ever want you to write me an essay that tells me what you think I want to hear, because what I want to hear is what you actually think.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of ties into that performative thing where you're talking about the cookie cutter, which is what they learn, right? You learn in high school that an essay looks like this.
Yeah.
It's like, no, it doesn't. Some do. Very few of them, actually, but some do. But in general, an essay looks like whatever it ends up looking like. And what you pointed out there was that you lead from the content,
Mm-hmm.
right? You let the content dictate the form rather than the other way around. And that can be a difficult thing to learn because it sounds obvious. And in some ways, it kind of is obvious. But then you sit down to do it, and you snap right back into your old habits.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing.
Yeah.
So you said you learned that in your, what was it, AP Euro?
I learned the bullet points thing in AP Euro when you're writing those AP essays and you're practicing for the test where you only have so much time. The whole like complex outline thing that they try to teach you with the 5-paragraph essay doesn't work because you just don't have enough time, and you can't spend an over amount of time figuring out what you're going to say because you only have 30 minutes to write this essay. So anytime I get an essay, I read the prompt, and the first thing I do is just what are the first things that come to mind when I read this, and I write that out. And often that's as much of an outline as I ever get around to. I know some people like much more built up outlines, but personally, again, kind of like you were saying, it's a lot more about following the content. And as you mentioned earlier, if you have an idea that comes up in the middle of writing, you got to be able to include that. So that kind of stuff, yeah, that like on the ball, just get it on paper, start writing. Don't overthink it is something that I learned through my AP classes. But I was also pretty fortunate. My 7th and 8th grade English teacher, I was in an advanced English class, and my teacher was a retired college professor. She didn't like the 5-paragraph essay. So in that like really key where they're really pounding into you, the 5-paragraph essay, at least at my public school, I mean, I got into a science course and they wanted us to, my science class wanted to write an essay, and they were big on the 5-paragraph. And I looked at it and I was like, what the heck is this? Because I was fortunate enough to have a teacher who wasn't interested in that. And so in a lot of ways, I had that head start of I didn't have such a rigid structure in my head.
Yeah. Or at least you had a sort of anchor point in your memory for what it was like not to write like that, or to write in some other way. I want to phrase it in a positive, not a negative light, because people, like as I was saying, people suck at not doing things. They're really good at doing something else, right? So you had some experience doing something else.
Yes, I had been given permission to write in a different way.
That's an interesting one. The permission.
Yeah, I think that's huge, actually. Like, to be given that permission, to be told, yes, you can write in a way that makes sense to you, and we will evaluate it on that, not based on what we think is what the teacher thinks the essay should look like.
And of course, there will be, certain standards.
Yeah.
But there, as far as, it's funny, I've been thinking recently about what might be the universal standards by which to judge an essay. And as far as I can tell, it's two things. Does it add up? And is it clear?
Yeah.
And I think as far as I can tell, I think that encompasses everything.
Yeah.
Because grammar is about being clear most of the time.
Yep.
And, all of your logic and all the different things that your professor can say about your argument, and they can critique this point and worry about the source you've used on this other point. But all of that comes down to, okay, does it add up?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's so. I'm trying to force a segue into what I promised this talk would actually be about. And I'm drawing a blank, so insert segue here. Here might be the actual segue. So I'm assuming you carried this process, or at least a version of it, through your time at Hamilton. Okay. Which is where, I should mention for the audience, Hamilton College is where Mariah and I went for our undergrad. And this sort of bullet point, essentially lay out the ideas and follow them onto the paper and adapt as you go. Is that kind of a...
Yeah. For more complex essays, I might have spent a little time looking at my bullet points, thinking about how I might arrange them to make the most sense, to transition most smoothly. But I was always pretty much a just right off the cuff. I never liked complex outlines that laid out like, oh, I'm going to talk about this. Yeah. I don't write like that. That's just not my style.
I've found, since UVA, I definitely do the put everything on the table first and then sort it out. So you write it's my analogy for it has been, or my metaphor, I guess, is that you have the bag of all your ideas by your side. And as you're taking them out to put them on the table, you can sort them out as you go, or you can dump the whole bag on the table, look at what you've got, and then sort it out. And I prefer the latter method, and it sounds kind of like what you prefer as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Because I just always found that, let's say, you pull out one thing, you sort it into a category, but then you pull out 10 other things and you realize that the categories you set up don't account for what you've actually got.
Yep.
So, you're doing unnecessary amounts of work by putting together an arrangement for the information, an arrangement which might not actually, and probably almost certainly will not account for the information when you actually have it out there. So you just have to go back and change it anyway. So, Mike Tyson, everyone's got a plan until he gets punched in the face. Or Sun Tzu, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Or Betsy Riopelle, my mother, with each plan, 5 things can go wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you can get upset. Which is actually my favorite one, because I think it implies that your plan should be halfway decent. But okay. So that's kind of how you do analytical writing.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do your creative writing? What happens when you sit down and write a poem, or start to write a poem? What is that? I don't know. What happens?
Yeah. I tend to end up starting poems with some line that got into my head that I can't quite get out. And the best poems, or the easiest to write ones, are ones that I sit there and before I ever actually write anything down on paper, I'm running through the lines in my head and working it out. But as anybody who has had great thoughts in the shower knows, you can have those thoughts, but getting them on paper doesn't always turn out. So, sometimes I'll start out with something, and then by the time I get to actually writing it down, I've forgotten it all. But I usually start out somewhere with something, a line, something I want to explore, and then I just start writing. I think my creative writing, whether it's poetry or even more true for any fiction writing I've done, I'm even less of an outliner. I often have no clue where my creative writing is going to take me. I just start from a starting place and see what happens, see where the words, if it's poetry or where the characters of its fiction take
It's
me.
very exploratory.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it definitely depends on like if I'm just writing to write something, or if I'm using a prompt, or if I want to try to fit into a form or something, then I might have a little more structure. But I mostly write free verse, so I'm usually not trying to fit into anything. So I can just kind of be like, okay, let's see where it takes me, and then go back and get rid of things I didn't like, or mix things around, or do whatever it needs to edit it and make it better. But yeah, kind of the whole idea of throwing everything you got on the table and then sorting it out later.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because you're the reference back to the analogy for analytical writing, because it sounds to me like, at least in maybe temperament, I don't know if that's the right word, but I'll use it. At least in temperament, it seems very similar to your analytical writing process, which is to say, you have an idea and you probably have at least some idea of where it might go, but you're not married to that. And you're more exploring it to figure out where it'll go, and going back to give shape to the whole idea after you've got the matter
Yeah,
somewhat played out.
yeah.
Okay. Sure. It's quite interesting. So do you think, so here's a question, and it may be a bad question. So that's kind of a corollary to what I'm about to ask, is this a bad question?
Okay.
But the question itself is, would you say that your analytical writing has a touch of your creative writing in it, or that your creative writing has a touch of the analytical writing in it? In other words, does that temperament come from one or the other? And then the reason it might be a bad question is that, is it more of like a thing that sits above both of them and feeds into each process? So I don't know. I'm very interested in the cognitive side of all this.
I would say it's definitely something that it sits above them and feeds into both. I think it's something about my personality and the way that I like to write that informs my writing no matter what I'm trying to write. That being said, I usually do, when you were first asking it, this may lead us totally off topic.
Go for it.
When you were first asking it, I was thinking, my creative writing is my creative writing. I don't really, other than topic, it can get influenced by the more academic, or for me, archaeology. Like my archaeology can influence the topic of my creative writing, but in terms of writing style, I don't see a lot of overlap there. But when I'm doing my analytic writing, I definitely try to bring in elements of the creative writing mindset just to make it more readable.
Interesting. That's very interesting, because so, I mean, I would agree, having known you and having spoken with you, and, you know, been trapped on an 1,800 person campus with you for 4 years. It does seem to me likely that it's almost a personality trait. Like, if I were to render it in psychological terms, I might say like openness and the big five, but now I am like, let me be clear here, I am way above my pay grade in that one. But so, and what I mean by that is that your writing and your personality, as I encountered it person to person, match. They match to some. It's very clear when I get a poem from you. It's like, yeah, I can see Mariah as having been the person to write this, right?
Yay.
Well, and part of that is also because I've read a lot of your poetry anyway, so I kind of know your voice. But even before that, it was, this person is in this poem. So I say all of this to support the, I suppose, hypothesis that this is sort of an ingrained personality trait, or an innate trait of some kind. But I'm not satisfied with that for two reasons. The first is probably not a good reason to be unsatisfied with it, which is, I don't know what to do with that, which is not a good reason to disbelieve the fact that that would be a personality trait, because whether or not we can do something with it doesn't have any bearing on whether it's the case. But
Yeah.
the other reason, I think it's a sounder reason, is that, as you pointed out, you was an 8th grade teacher who was able to cultivate, at least on the analytical side, that sort of open and creative process temperament. Again, I'm just circling back to the word temperament for that one. So I'm curious, I suppose. So we've talked a little bit about your writing, and we've talked a little about the way that you go about completing writing, and now I'm very interested in how you develop that process. So I'm just going further and further down the rabbit hole here. But what is it, if you could sum up in some way the thing that you learned from that 8th grade experience, or similar lessons around that?
Mm-hmm.
What might that lesson have been?
I I think the lesson that I learned from that was that kind of honestly, like, going back to what you were saying about how do you, like, critique an essay, what makes a good essay. Like, I was that teacher taught me that a good essay is something that's readable and understandable and gets a point across, but it doesn't matter as much how it does that as long as it does it. And going back to the idea of permission, of this teacher gave me the permission of, if I felt like I needed a paragraph in there to connect to ideas that had their own paragraphs, then I could do it. And I think just having that freedom and that permission, I think it is something teachable. Um, and it's, I think, I think there's something teachable there, that the way that I've manifested it goes with my personality. But I think there's a teachable something that can manifest in its own ways in people with slightly different personalities who might manifest it a little differently. It might look different in the process, but it all comes from the same root and all leads to this more open writing style that lets you more exploratory writing.
So that's very, so did how did your teacher communicate to you this permission? How did you know that, for example, you were allowed to write that paragraph in between 2 other paragraphs?
Well, basically, she just said, don't write a 5 paragraph essay, or like, I don't expect a 5 paragraph essay. I expect you to write as many paragraphs as you need to get this idea across.
Okay. And then that, so because I can say, and I do say that more or less to my students, and then and then a lot of them sink back into their habits anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Was it something where, I know I'm asking you to go pretty far back in your memory here,
Yeah.
but was it something where you had to try it first? You had to take that chance, not knowing whether it would work out on an essay, and you got something back, and like the feedback that you got from having attempted that kind of writing for an essay showed you more sort of viscerally that actually, yeah, I can do this for this teacher?
I'm sure it did. I mean,
But
well,
now we're kind of at the ends of your specific memory here.
I mean, I don't remember
Yeah, and
the
like I
specific assignments, but I also think, I think part of it too is it happened at such a period in my life that I hadn't already had that 5-paragraph essay so deeply ingrained in me. I'd been introduced to the idea, but I hadn't done it for years and years and years. So when I was given the permission to not do it, and honestly, I hated it to start with, I never did well with the 5-paragraph essays. They were too confining, and they never worked for me. But I think when I was given the permission and then I did write an essay like that and I got good marks back on it, it kind of cemented in, oh, okay, I can write this essay without having this structure that makes me cringe and get good marks. And so, okay, I can keep doing this and I can build on it throughout time.
So it's a sort of experiential learning process. I mean, again, I'm obviously driving at something that seems to me to be true from other angles. So I don't mean to take that lens to your memory and cram it all into that way of thinking about it. Because I've also had students who you can tell them, tell me what you actually think, and then they'll actually do it, right? Mm-hmm. But I can't tell if but it's because of the nature of the thing, because it's something I tell them the first day. I don't know if those students are the ones who may have been like you to begin with, right? Yeah. So I don't know. It's the trouble with trying to collect experimental data on, teaching methods or writing methods is that there's always risk, right? I can try to teach my students a certain way, but I'm playing with their education. And I can try to write something for my teachers in a new way, but I'm playing with my grade. And it's hard to find a situation for either of those in which the risk of failure is low enough to permit experimentation or to encourage experimentation. Mm-hmm. Now, fortunately, with the teaching, at least, you're always trying to teach your students to the best of your ability. So if you have a new idea and you think it's going to work better than anything else you've tried, you can kind of do it, and it's morally acceptable to do that, because what else would you be doing than the best that you can do? And maybe some of the same applies for the writing. It's difficult because the incentive structures are slightly different. And they're real world concerns, right? You got a student who's trying to do pre-med or trying to get into like the business school or something. And, you do have to get good grades. I mean, that's not a passing concern. Yeah. It's just a very interesting question. So change that. I don't think I ever heard what your archaeology thesis was about. And this shocks me. I was thinking about it the other day and I read, I have a copy of her creative writing one. So what was your archaeology thesis about? It's worth noting, and I'll shill you a little bit more here. It's worth noting that, hold on, let's see if I can remember these. So you won at least the junior creative writing prize. Yeah, now I'm gonna embarrass you. Here we go. You won the Thomas A. Meehan creative writing prize in junior year. The chapbook, I can't remember the Rosen something or whatever.
Rosenfeld, I think.
Something like that. Basically, she won the prize where he's the best, was it specifically poetry or was it creative writing across the board?
I think it was creative writing across the board, but it had to be chapbook length, so it would have been a set of poems or a short story.
Right. So she basically won the prize that the college publishes your work for you in senior year. You did honors in both creative writing and
archaeology,
and just top it. I'm probably missing one or two things, but you also graduated summa cum laude, so there you go. All of that to say, you know what you're doing, but I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what you did for your archaeology thesis. I can't believe I never asked this.
Oh, I think you probably heard about it, but you probably don't remember.
I'm sure I did.
Yeah, so I did Devotage Analysis. And so Devotage is the little tiny pieces that come off when you're making a stone tool like an arrowhead. basically I took all the devotage pieces that we had found at the site in British Columbia that we do our field school every other year at. And I analyzed a bunch of different attributes on these little tiny pieces of rock. So things like how much they weighed, how big they were. The top is called a platform, and so I measured like platform length, length and width, all kinds of different attributes on that. And then I used that and some studies that other people had done to try to talk about what stages of tool production we're seeing at the site, with the idea of if you're getting material from nearby, if you're getting the material that you're going to make a stone tool from nearby, you can just go and pick up the whole cobble and bring it back. All the
Now I'm
icky
starting to
stuff.
remember. Yeah.
Yeah, all the icky stuff on the outside or whatever, it doesn't matter. It doesn't take that much energy to bring it back home. But if you're getting your material from really far away, you're going to work it a little bit there so that you're only bringing the good stuff home. You're going to slim it down and knock off the big chunks. And so the expectation was for that we would see some material types that had all the stages of production going on, and some material types that only had these later stages when you're just kind of finishing it up. But what we found instead was
Okay, this is interesting.
Yeah, what I found instead was pretty much everything that I had access to was all from the very last stages of production, which doesn't make sense because this is a winter village site. When the heck else are you going to be making stone tools, a bunch of stone tools? You would do it in the winter. And we also knew that some of these we could source to pretty local areas. So it wouldn't make sense for them to only be sharpening or doing the very finishing touches on a tool. They have to be doing more. But the thing is, we know through ethnographic records, like historic records of these people, and from hearing from their ancestors, they swept their floors.
Ah! No consideration for the archaeology work of the future.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure that's what went on, is that all I'm finding is these little pieces that got left when they swept their floors, and we just haven't found where they're dumping their trash to.
Okay, okay, what's interesting to me there in a podcast about writing is that you had a hypothesis, you began to analyze the data and work through it, and you realized that it didn't add up, so you had to change the hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right? You came across the new ideas that you needed to account for in analyzing and describing the things that you were seeing. So when did the timeline of this from investigation of, was this the Slocan and Narrows, by the way?
Yes, it was.
Okay. It's worth noting she wrote a poem about that. I can't remember the name of it, but I know that I read it several times. But you did this over the summer,
mm-hmm.
right? And then when did you start writing the actual document thesis? Like, what was the process of hands in the dirt investigation, printed paper?
Yeah, so hands in the dirt investigation was summer 2015. Summer 2016, I got hired on by my professors to work in the lab over the summer and do the first kind of level of devotage analysis, which is how I ended up doing this for my thesis. I did just the first level that was very basic, of just how many flakes of each size and material type of each do we have, and I went through and counted them
Just
all.
raw data.
Yeah, raw data. And I started doing some of the background research for developing the list of attributes I would use for my thesis during that summer. through some consultation with my professors. And then, so then throughout my senior year, I spent pretty much most of the fall continuing to do the raw data collection, and early winter I started running graphs and statistical analysis and that kind of stuff.
And by this point, you kind of knew you were doing it for your thesis?
Oh, yeah.
Did you know when you started the summer work before our senior year that you were going to be doing it for your thesis?
Not really. I had a bit of an idea. I had talked a little bit with my professor, and we knew that Anna Arn was going to be doing the faunal stuff. She wanted to do faunal for her thesis, so she analyzed the faunal stuff, and then we pretty much only have faunal and lithic.
Faunal as in like fauna, animals?
Yes, bones. Yeah, sorry.
I figured I know, but sometimes the voice quality can get a little...
Yes, yeah, and I try to be good about throwing out technical terms, but if I miss one, please
That's hardly a technical term. I'm really being nitpicky with you, but go on. This is a tangent.
Anyway, so knew Anna was going to do that. I didn't want to do the soil chemistry stuff, and also Emily Rubenstein had done that the previous year for her thesis. It kind of left us with lithic stuff if I wanted to do something based on this site.
Lithic is about rocks, by the way. Go on.
Thank you. Left me with the rocks. And so I kind of fell into it, and I kind of went into the summer going, let's see if we can find a thesis topic here. I just didn't know what the thesis topic would be yet. And over the summer, I kind of developed into it.
Well, there you go again, right? There's discovery.
Yes.
It's exploratory. It wasn't a metaphor before, but it's even less of a metaphor now to call it discovery, because you're literally going in unearthing. You're discovering things in the ground. You're discovering them. You're taking the dirt cover off of them, and then those things are. But like I say, it's kind of funny, but it's I have this very wild theory in my head that the way you can talk about the writing process also describes things like trees. And the basic premise there is something we've obviously touched on a lot in this conversation, which is that, you have to make a plan and then be willing to adapt it. And you had, going into this, you discovered these things in the ground, and then you worked with them, and you thought about them, and what happened in some way is that the rocks that you pulled out of the ground turned into ideas, which then turned into words on paper, and that all of that is actually part of the same discovery process. Because I'm sure that while you were writing the thesis, you were revising your ideas and coming to new conclusions. Is that fair? That's what I would expect. I couldn't imagine that you could go over a long enough a process that. How long did you spend on the actual writing? I should ask that.
So the way we set it up, we kind of did it in chunks. So in the fall, I started with the background and outlining my methods and that kind of stuff, the kind of things that I could do before I had results. And then in the spring, I did a big chunk write-up frantically.
Right. Once you had the results and you could actually write about them.
Yes, yeah, and that was when I wrote up the results. But I mean, throughout the whole process, I was talking with my professors, my advisors, about what was going on, what I was seeing. Even before I actually ran all the data through the statistical analysis and stuff that told me this conclusion that, it's all this late stage stuff. I was looking at it and going, there's nothing big here. There's no way, there has to be something else going on. And we had talked about it previously about how they swept their floors, and it almost ended up being me just proving this idea that we had. But
that's worth something.
Yeah.
Right. That's people think that research needs to discover some huge new thing, but no. not necessarily, like there's definitely publication incentives toward that end, but you know, and it's not like you didn't change. It's like you said, it's not like you didn't actually discover something new. It's just that you formulated a hypothesis early on.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and my hypothesis, well, so it's kind of funny because if you actually read my thesis, it's all set up of like, we're going to do this, we're going to analyze it, we're going to talk about where they're coming from, and all this kind of might get into like inequality or change over time. And I ended up not being able to say anything about any of that. And it's really just my conclusion that says, well, since we can't say anything about this, and this is what it's pointing to, and we've heard ethnographically, it probably does mean that they swept their floors. So it's like my initial hypothesis got not even disproven. I just didn't have enough data.
It's not supported.
Yeah, it's not supported. But in not supporting that, I ended up being able to say something else.
There you go. Right. That you decided to what's the I don't think I need to make another analogy at that point because we've already made one to rocks and dirt and sweeping floors. But I think that, again, if I'm trying to circle back to, so here's the idea, I'll pitch it to you, and then the implicit question is, what do you think about this, and tell me if I'm crazy. It seems to me that if we figured out anything in the last few minutes, it's that what's common between your creative writing process, your analytical writing process, and even your hands in the dirt archaeological process is that they're all processes of discovery, of exploration. That it is a thing that is, like I said, fundamentally you have an idea, you think it's right, but you're testing it to make sure, and then you're willing to adapt as needed. And I think that basic process is actually so fundamental. And this is something I've talked to my students about and probably driven them insane before. Driven them insane with. But I think that process describes something that's basically fundamental to existence itself.
Oh, yeah.
Namely, something like, if you wanted to go really, really abstract and grandiose with it, and I do want to do that, you would say it's a sort of tension between chaos and order, where, like I was saying before about a tree, well, a tree has a plan. The tree's plan is, I'm going to be here. This is where I'm going to be, and I'm going to be a tree right here. And its plan is supported by its trunk. And that plan, that trunk, is tough, it's structured, and that's why it can be there at all, because it is doing anything. It has any kind of structure, any kind of plan, so it's not nothing. Mm-hmm. But then that plan has to be able to, as the plan is resilient to change and impact, say from a light breeze, the plan will remain intact. And as it can bend a bit for larger, stronger breezes, it will still remain intact. And eventually something will come along that the plan does not have enough flexibility to accommodate, namely, a lumberjack puts an axe through the bark. Typically, the plans that trees make do not typically have enough flexibility in them to account for a lumberjack. Right? But this describes that any good plan needs a maintenance function. And for the process of writing essays or poetry or doing investigative archaeological or other scientific work, the maintenance function might be something like an underlying temperamental attachment to discovery as a process and goal, where the goal is not to prove something that one has already set out and just confirm your own biases, but rather an actual desire to find out stuff that you didn't know before. And maybe that's the right thing to try to do. Am I crazy? No, hold on. No, that's a bad question. Am I wrong? Because I might be crazy and right. I don't know.
I don't think you want me to answer that first one.
I think that's the answer to it, isn't it?
I think you're right, though. I think discovery and exploration and discovery for the purpose of learning, not for the purpose of proving something that you're so tied to, is so central to honestly everything we do or should be doing in life. I mean, maybe I'm a little biased on that because in choosing to go for archaeology, I've literally kind of dedicated my life to the science thing, which is just what can we learn?
But that is the scientific method, right? The scientific method is just it's a systematized trial and error process.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think it's important in essay. I think that same approach can be really good for essay writing. Just kind of like we're trying to figure out what you're trying to say, and maybe that takes you a while to get there, and maybe that means when you're actually presenting it, you have to go back and cut things up to make it make sense to somebody else. But the important part is the process of getting there, and then you can go back and streamline it.
So toss out the 5-paragraph essay.
Yes. Please, dear goodness.
We did it. Full circle. This is great. Oh. No, it's funny because I think it's easy to talk about this stuff in the abstract. And like I said, it's easier to talk about this in the abstract, but like what I really want for my students to realize is that this is pragmatically real. There's a plaque at UVA, University of Virginia, and it says, what does it say? Enter by, it's like over the old entrance to the original college. Enter by this gateway to seek the way of honor, the light of truth, the will to work from man, and man in the general sense. But I take that second line and say, like, okay, to seek the light of truth. All right, sounds like something you'd find on back of a Hallmark card in the corner of a CVS. It does. It sounds aphoristic. Mm-hmm. You got to realize that someone thought those words are important enough to carve them literally into stone and stick in the most visible place they could see, so that today's UVA students, my former UVA students, if you already know this, but that plaque is for you. It's not for anyone else. It's for you. And they wanted you to see it. And maybe they take them seriously. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe it means that seeking the light of truth isn't just some aphoristic head in the clouds goal. Maybe it's actually a real thing that you can take practical steps to do. You know, when you were gathering your data for the archaeology thesis, what you did was collect data. What you did was look at the thing, measure it, and then type the thing down in the spreadsheet. I'm assuming you use a spreadsheet.
Yes, I did.
Yeah. God to help you if you didn't.
Oh,
But the point of that is that using a spreadsheet is actually a practical part of a truth-seeking process. Mm-hmm. So it is real. It's not made up or, you know, some aphorism, you know, but.
Yeah, I think I would also add to that of it's not, or it's something that you practice.
Say more.
Yeah, so seeking truth in your writing, discovering in your writing, whatever. It's not a one time I'm going to sit down and the first time I do this, I'm going to do it great and it's going to work out. Just like my best poetry writing tends to come in the middle of, I've been writing, usually when I'm in a creative writing class, I'm writing every week. I'm writing multiple poems a week. And let me tell you, if I write 5 poems, there might be one good one in there. And it's it's building that practice and keep writing. And then as you keep writing, you'll get more and more good ones out of it. They're still not all going to be good, but you'll get more and more good ones. You're building that muscle in your brain that says, okay, I'm sitting down. This is how I'm going to turn my brain on to write a poem. The same thing applies with essays. The first couple essays you write, especially if you're trying to make a big shift in how you're thinking about writing essays, you're going to struggle. It's going to be hard. But if you keep practicing, it'll come more naturally, and you'll get used to that feeling of following the tendril, seeking out whatever, following this line of thought that came up and following it down and seeking out that truth. And you'll get better at doing it. It'll happen faster. It'll happen smoother. I don't want to say like you're ever going to get perfect at it, because you're not.
Yeah, because that's why we still have
ongoing process
colleges and peer review. And podcasts, I guess.
Why not?
But that's no. Do you have 5 more minutes to talk about that? Because we could really launch a whole other hour on that, but I'm not going to ask you for that. But the point about practicing I'm trying to say it without saying the word practical, but I can't. So practicing a practical truth-seeking process, and all the alliteration that apparently entails.
Oh, I love alliteration.
Yeah, I know.
You do.
But that's a real thing, right? It's a thing you can sit down and do, and you'll do it badly, and then you'll do it again, and you'll do it slightly less badly, which is similar in some sense to the process of actually developing a thesis, where your first thesis is bad. My students ask me, how do I make sure my thesis is right the first time I write it down? And I say, you won't. It will suck. It will be wrong or incomplete in some way, and that's actually the point. So as you stumble along in your process of developing a thesis, so too do you seem to stumble along in your process of developing a thesis. Or in other words, you can write a thing, and that takes a trial and error process, and so does learning to write.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's very interesting. Can you hear those dogs?
I didn't hear the dog.
Excuse me for a moment. We'll be back after these messages from Mariah, who was stalling for time.
Oh, don't make me stall for time. I feel like I just got on my soapbox. Now I'm off. I don't know what soapbox to get on at this point, except for keep writing. Oh, here's a soapbox. For all you analytical writers, science writers. Okay, when I wrote my thesis, it was in some ways the most soul deadening writing I ever had to do. And you can't hear it, but Bane is laughing hysterically right now.
I am laughing my head off while my mic is muted, so my dogs won't bother you. Go on, Mariah.
Anyways, I hate analytical writing. The style that you need to write in, you're told you need to write in to get published for scientific papers. I hate that style of writing. It is so boring. So please, dear goodness, if we can make a revolution of us new upcoming...
Oh, you're calling for revolutions on my podcast now. All right. Let's hear it.
I want a revolution of scientists who can write.
You heard it here. Mariah just called out the entire scientific community and said that they write like crap. That is definitely a fair paraphrase of what she said, and not at all twisting it for comedic effect.
science communication is a thing and more people need it. And even if we're not going to offer science communication classes, just kind of a lot of what we've been talking about here of not being so tight into a structure and allowing it to lead, allowing your writing to lead where it wants to lead, as long as your reader can follow it and can make sense of it, and bringing in things from the creative writing side, like varying your sentence length and varying your phrases so you're not saying the same thing over and
Just
over
talking
again.
like a human,
Yeah,
not a
talk like
robot.
a human.
I don't want to read a robot's writing.
Exactly.
There are plenty of like auto-generated text things online nowadays. If I want a robot to write my paper, I can get that. I'm asking you to write it, you know?
Yep.
So,
Yep. And that's one where, like, when you're an undergrad, when you're going through school, you may have to kind of give up some of it and be a little bit robotic. But please, dear goodness, once you get out, if you can, once you've kind of established yourself, and to the extent that you can while you're in it, like, try to make your writing accessible to more than just the people in your very niche little part of academia.
that's I mean, have you I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but have you ever read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity?
I don't think I've read that one.
So, first of all, I'd recommend it. Because I know you're Christian and it's C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
But in the context of this conversation, um, I don't know that I've ever read anything that does a better job of taking an incredibly complex subject. I mean, he's talking theology, philosophy. He's like trying to explain why, for example, like a dualistic view of a singular God doesn't make sense. That's his proposal. I mean, you can
Okay.
agree with it or not agree with it based on the reading, but the point is that's that's a really high level philosophical theological concept, and he
Yeah.
lays it out so simply. And it is, it's so. I just wrote a paper for my rhetoric class that had a lot to do with economics as well. So I'm delving into high level rhetorical theory at the same time as I'm introducing economic theory into the same paper. And I said, okay, how do I want to do this? I want to write this like Lewis. And I think it worked. They didn't kick me out of school, so I think it worked, at least in that regard. So I mean, just anyone listening, if you're looking for an example of someone who can write about extremely complex things with incredible clarity, and you just want to hear what that sounds like, I would look at some of the early I mean, any of the chapters, but I think some of the early chapters, especially of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. You know, whether or not you agree with the philosophy or any of it at all, it's as I hit my mic, it's just an excellent, it's an excellently written thing. So, and I also recommend it to you, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's been on my like vague to read list, but now it can move up to the like I should really read this list.
Well, it's short too, right? Because he doesn't use more words than he needs to.
Yeah, just lovely. And it goes back to, I think it's often attributed to Einstein. I don't know if it actually is, but a quote that I've heard several times of, if you can't explain something to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it well enough yourself.
Yeah.
Which,
I don't know if that's Einstein, but that trip rings a bell somewhere in the back of my head.
yeah, and there's some, you definitely have to take into account that when you're writing a college essay or you're writing an academic paper to be published, you can take into account that your audience is going to be have a vocabulary and an understanding that's greater than a 5-year-old.
Right.
But the point that you need, if you can't break it down simply, then you need to go back and look at it more and understand it better, is a point that I think stands no matter what you're writing or doing.
Well, I would push it even a little. I mean, you mentioned that, your professors will probably have a greater vocabulary than a 5-year-old. And that's, probably, I would hope that's true. Guess it depends on the 5-year-old.
There's some pretty precocious 5-year-olds out there.
Yeah, probably the sons and daughters of professors. But regardless, you make the point that, you can expect them to be more versed in the subject matter that you're talking about. But I would actually push this a little bit further, so far as to say that when at the end of your writing process, when you've written out let's say your first draft even, you are probably the world's leading expert on what your essay says.
True.
So there is no one in the world who better knows what that essay says than you do. I don't care if your professor would understand where it would go wrong or where it would be right, or understands the underlying subject matter. That's not what I'm talking about. The actual argument that you're presenting, you're the expert. So you're always it seems to me that you're always in some sense talking to a less expert audience. Yeah. At least in that small way, right? So this is all pragmatically a caution against assuming that your professors are going to understand your tangled syntax. Don't do that. Your professors have a lot of essays to read. I usually have to read 18 to 20 something every time you turn them in. So for my students, please, for the love of all things holy, make my job easy. As Margie Thixton would say, write a reader-friendly paper.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Margie.
Yeah. Well, in any event, I don't mean to hold you up any longer. Do you have any final advice that you would like to pass on to the generations of college students that will be coming in the future after this podcast blows up and has millions and millions of subscribers? What will you say to the people? That's good. Okay. No, honestly, but do you have all kidding aside, do you have any final thoughts you wanted to get off your chest?
Get something on the paper or on your computer screen. That's the first step to writing anything. I hate staring at a blank page.
Yeah.
It's so uninspiring.
Well, I think that's probably a good note to end on. Yeah. So thank you, Mariah.
Yeah, thank you.
We will see you all next time. You've just finished an episode of Things that First-Year Writers Need to Hear. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing. It'd help this reach more people. And check out another episode if you want, or maybe something a bit shorter if you'd prefer.